Thank you, Jerry, for the opportunity to talk to you. I'd like to start with my last two slides to say a bit more about system innovation, what it is. Because I think so far we've not quite addressed the topic that this conference should be about. I mean, it's not a conference on technical innovation and green growth, it's about system innovation. So I think there's something new in this agenda. And these are just two examples I've got. One is about the transport system, the next is the electricity system. So yes, that is partly about technology, green cars, battery electric, fuel cell, biofuels, hybrids. But it's also about fuel and charging infrastructures. It's also about new business models. Car sharing, carpooling, and Uber, we already heard in the previous talk. But it's also about smart ticketing and maybe intermodal transport systems where you can easily shift between transport modes. And it's about the role of ICT and dynamic traffic management and maybe the role of self-driving cars. And potentially about modal shift towards trains, trams, buses, and cycling. So I think system innovation in the transport domain is much broader than just electric cars. And the same for the electricity system. Yes, renewables are important. Solar, wind, biopower, we've heard about. But it's also about new entrants and completely new business models. There's new entrants in that sector with community energy, citizen producers, farmers. There's a complete flux, as Jan showed, about the kind of business models. Then also, of course, you've got the regime fighting back, CCS, shale gas. But also you have complementary technologies in electricity storage and battery. You need backup capacity to deal with the intermittency problem that leads to new regulations like capacity markets. You need to extend the grid to deal with intermittency, so super grids, smart grids, bidirectional flows, which is very difficult for the grid infrastructure managers. And also on the demand side, you may have innovations like smart meters, demand response tariffs, peak shifting, and new energy services. So I think for me this is quite important if we talk about systems innovation that we get the topic right from the start. I think the keynote by Professor Beinhacker did address some of these issues from a very well-presented, I think, mainstream economics perspective. So it was good, but it did focus mainly on the technical dimensions. And because mainstream economics has got a rational choice perspective, the main answer then is get the prices right. So then everything will move automatically. So I did think Jan's presentation was very good because he presented much more an action perspective. So he talked very much about visions and networks and strategy and learning. I think none of these things were mentioned in the Beinhacker presentation. It's almost as if there are no actors that have to do things. So I also felt it was a little bit, personally, it was a bit weak on the innovation side. It just was all about a learning curve, but nothing about the actors and the capabilities and the struggle. So I think that's the mainstream way of looking. But of course, you've also written on evolutionary economics, which is about industry structures. Jan was also talking about institutional theory. You can look at business studies, which actually look at the difficulties that firms have to reorient. And of course, the talk by IBM was very nice. It does show incumbent firms can reorient. So those are some of my discussant perspectives, just to be a bit provocative. I was also asked to talk about the role of incumbents. So that's maybe where I slightly disagree with Jan Rotbans, who literally said we need to do everything to keep it out of the hands of the incumbents, of the regime players. Which I can understand, and certainly in some sectors I think that is true. But my pitch will be there are also opportunities to work with the incumbents and to give them a role in the transition, in the system innovation, that also maybe make them less resistant. Because as Jan said, they've got a lot of power to hold back and to fight and to resist. So if you give them an opportunity, then maybe they can move along with you. So this picture has become a bit of a standard. Well, it's one way of looking at transitions, where you've got in a regime, which is, as we know from evolutionary economics, all this literature on path dependence and lock-in and inertia, it's unwilling to change. And at the bottom level, you've got all these niche innovations and new entrants that Jan highlighted, where lots of learning is going on and tinkering, and hopefully the transition will happen if many things happen at the same time. This does, however, portray the incumbent firms as mainly part of the problem, because they are part of the regime, so they are locked in and inert and resistant to change. So there's a lot of emphasis on the role of routines and standard operating procedures. You've got the role of sunk investments and capabilities, but also industry mindsets and identity. So there's a lot of reasons why big firms don't want to change. That kind of perspective, which I also have helped to elaborate, does place a lot of high hopes on the new entrants. But of course, the new entrants are, I think, definitely part of the story, but they also face problems like this often, particularly if they're very radical new entrants, like community energy, farmers. Often they've got a lack of skills in a particular sector. It may be more difficult for them to have access to finance. Sometimes they represent only a small part of the population, so that may create problems with legitimacy. They may be too radical compared with the mainstream, and therefore there's difficulties in scaling up. So while we should acknowledge the role of new entrants to get a transition going, I think it's also fruitful to think about potential transition pathways where incumbents do at least play a bit of a role. And there's two options here. One is regime transformation, where the incumbent players gradually reorient their strategy. And I thought the IBM case was quite a nice example, and you already mentioned the working with new entrants and changing your business models. This is, of course, what you also see in the transport sector, because many of the electric vehicles and the hybrids and the fuel cells are developed by the car companies themselves. And also in some countries like the UK, it's the electricity companies that are doing most of the wind farms and utility-scale solar and big biomass. So incumbents can reorient under certain circumstances. The second potential pathway is reconfiguration. So that's new combinations between new and old. It means it doesn't have to be a disruptive pattern where one goes up and the other goes down. New entrants replace incumbents. So the Schumpeterian pattern is sometimes true, but the business literature also says there can also be new coalitions between new entrants and incumbents. And again, I thought the example was a very good one. However, that's nice, but reorientation of big incumbents is going to be very difficult, because as Jan pointed out, there are many reasons why they are likely to resist the transition. They will protect their sunk investments. They will try to milk their assets and go as slow as possible to get return on investment. We also know from the past that innovation is risky, and most strategic reorientations fail. And the problem with green growth is, of course, that the markets are uncertain, because partly they are still dependent on policies, and policies can also be reversed, as we've now seen in the UK. And on the other hand, they're dependent on consumers, which are so far fairly reluctant to really pay for things that are more expensive. So it's maybe a few % of the population that is willing to pay more for an electric vehicle or for green electricity, but it's not yet the majority. So it's quite understandable why the big firms want to go slow, because they see a lot of the risks. This does mean that a reorientation requires pressures on these incumbent firms, which should come either from civil society and social movements, from policymakers who introduce substantial and tough policies, but preferably also for consumers and markets, because only when the big firms see a real market opportunity are they likely to seriously reorient. This means we need a slightly broader way of looking at an industry. This picture sort of plays on the Michael Porter framework of 5 forces, but it adds also a socio-political environment. So you've also got policymakers, you also have civil society. And this picture shows that big industries are not the rational choice optimizers, as mainstream economics says. According to business studies, big firms are also locked in. They've got particular capabilities, they've got particular mindsets and belief systems, a certain mission and identity, and also there are laws and regulations. So this is very close to what Jan said about the structures, cultures, and practices. This also means that big firms play multiple strategies at the same time. So yes, they do economic positioning strategies, supply chain management, marketing and pricing. They also do innovation strategy, knowledge management, R&D collaboration, product development. But they also do framing strategy, which is public relations and making statements in the press. So I thought Jan's statement about this CEO of this French utility, well, that's what those guys are supposed to do. They make these statements. And my colleague next to me said, yeah, but actually they're also buying up solar firms. So they can at the same time say, no, we don't want to change, but at the same time they may secretly begin to reorient. And I think that's what we should expect. Firms will say one thing here, but do another thing elsewhere. And then fourthly, they also do corporate political strategies. Particularly the huge big firms in oil, gas, nuclear, cars are hugely powerful, and they've got all kinds of ways in which they can influence policy. This means green reorientation is a gradual process. I fully agree with Jan that the transition is going to consist of several phases. And I've done several case studies of industry reorientation in the past, and they always start with resistance. So in the beginning, these industries say, no, it can't be done. It's too expensive. The problem is not caused by us. It can't be addressed. Then gradually in the second phase, as the pressures begin to build, they start hedging. So they do a little bit, their mainstream strategy is still to protect their sunk investments, but they will start investing a little bit in alternatives. And I think in many industries, that's where we are now. Then the third phase would be diversification, when they are seriously going for markets. And you get these innovation races, jockeying for position. And then in the fourth phase only do you get a full reorientation when it's embedded in their economic strategy. This is unfortunately not a deterministic process, so it's not guaranteed that if you start at phase 1 you will end up automatically in phase 4. It really depends on the accumulation of the external pressures and on the internal learning processes. So it does depend on rising public attention, and unfortunately we know public attention goes up, but it also goes down. Strengthening policies are important, and again we know policies can get stronger, but they also get weaker. Particularly if there's a crisis, as we see in the UK steel industry or in the past with the US car industry. And crucially, it also depends on market demand. So I've got two more slides. And this is just a very brief example of two historical cases. The first one is the reorientation of the US car industry around safety, where people were being killed in their cars. So you see a first peak of reorientation in R&D patents. R&D patents are in airbags and seatbelts, which was after 1965 very tough legislation which introduced standards on seatbelts. And so then you see the industry is reorienting, but not wholeheartedly. So it was not until the 1990s when consumers really began to care about safety, and it became a part of their consideration of buying a car. That's when you really see the markets were materializing, and then all of a sudden the industry can go full out, and they're really upscaling, and it can go really fast. But they were fighting the regulations all the time from 1965. So they did reorient a little bit, but they only reoriented fully when they saw there was a market opportunity. And the second slide is about the US car industry and climate change, where it's a much more diverse picture of patenting. Basically, the story is they have not decided which one is going to win. The US regulations are not yet tough enough. There's not yet a clear market. So you see they're hedging their bets. They mostly patent in hybrids. They are doing more now in battery electric vehicle, but they are still also doing fuel cell vehicles. So I'd say this is still in the hedging phase. This is not even yet diversification, let alone full reorientation, because there are no clear markets and the policies are not yet strong enough. So my last slide, because I was asked to give 3 potential knowledge gaps and future OECD work priorities. I think the first is to understand incumbent firms, both as the problem, but also potentially as a solution, which means better understand the dilemmas and the uncertainties of green reorientation. So don't portray them just as the bad guys. Also, maybe try to work with them, because if they see opportunities, they've got the skills, they've got the money, they've got the political context to make things go really fast. The second is to understand firms as a multi-dimensional entity. So don't only focus on patenting, which admittedly I've also just done in my 2 slides. Their innovation strategies are part of a broader corporate strategy, where they also think about their competitors, where they also think about framing, and they also think about a political strategy. And then the last point, which I already illustrated with my first 2 slides, was don't just focus on single technologies if you are interested in system innovation. You really need to look at multiple technologies, but also at the social innovations and the institutional innovations, which are occurring in all these different sectors. I think that's the challenge for today and tomorrow, to properly talk about system innovation, which is more than technologies. Thank you very much.